Hey everybody, Rob Veno here of Rob Veno Sports here on a Wednesday night. National Signing Day took place today, so we'll talk a little bit about, in generalities, of course, anybody who's watched it all day long, you get expert opinion from guys all across the networks, whether it be Big Ten Network or the ESPN networks, and if you're online, obviously a lot of CBS Sports and 247 coverage, guys who have actually seen these high school football players play. Tonight I'll be joined by Rob OConnor. You guys hear us together enough. We did a lot of college football and handicapping podcasts throughout the college football season. Now we're into college basketball, which you'll hear from us again Friday, but during the middle of the week, as you know now, we're trying to keep college football talk alive here. So we have our weekly podcast, and we're going to go through head coaching changes once again this week, like Derek Davis and I did a couple of weeks back. We'll give you three more that we find significant. I'll throw my angle in. Rob will throw his angle in. Maybe we can try to sort some things out here as we head towards spring ball and try to get a feel for how these programs are going to either be positively affected or negatively affected, for that matter. But to do all this, I need to bring in our analyst here. So right now, let's welcome him in, Rob OConnor. Rob, how you doing this evening, buddy?
I'm doing well. It's been a very busy day in the world of college football for not having any games on the card today, but things are starting to take shape. The college football signing day rankings are in from ESPN, and we're kind of shaking out who the winners are, who the losers are, and looking forward to talking about that and some of these coaching changes as well.
Yeah, let's go ahead and throw a couple of thoughts out there, Rob. And again, for those listening tonight, obviously both of us come from handicapping backgrounds. Obviously, I'm in the handicapping profession every single day and in the betting game. So we tend to deal mostly with what's on the field in front of us, point spreads and totals that are put in front of us. I, for one, do not see much of high school football throughout the season, maybe a stray telecast here or there on ESPN where I'll watch. So I usually take this stuff with a grain of salt and, listen to the people who have actually seen these guys play, look at some footage. But I'll tell you, Rob, there were a couple of interesting things, and guys like us who, handicap and bet, we can take a couple of things from this National Signing Day. I'll start with something funny just for to kick off the show here. I thought it was kind of interesting to note that there's 128 FBS schools. I think this year Coastal Carolina kicks into the Sun Belt, and we'll have 129. Or actually, we'll still have 128 because Idaho got moved.
Idaho leaves they're going back down to FCS, I believe.
Right, so we get a one-for-one substitution here. We'll see Coastal Carolina take their place in the Sun Belt. So out of the 128, when I was going through full National Signing Day rankings here, I found that there's some, believe it or not, there are some FBS teams that don't rank inside the top 128. There are some FCS squads that had better recruiting days than FBS. So to that tune, you feel sorry somewhat for UTEP, Texas El Paso, which, according to 247 Sports, finished 134th today, not even good enough to be in the top 128. New Mexico State finishing 139th. Just find that interesting that FBS schools cannot recruit as good as some FCS schools can, and I'm sure it's based primarily on maybe one of these lower rung schools in the FCS getting a 4-star, let's say, where these other teams didn't get any. But it just is interesting that those teams can't get into the top 128 yet. As I look, two Ivy League teams are there, Harvard and Yale, at 127 and 128. So from the dregs to the top of the pile here, Robin, believe me, I use the word dregs here in February, but when it comes to September, I'll find my way to playing some New Mexico State games, whether it be side or total. I did last year. I did the year before. All of these teams, when they attach a point spread and total to them, they become our friends or our enemies one way or another. But as far as the signing day today goes, we all know, I think we knew going in Alabama would be on top. I think Kirby Smart in his second year at Georgia, very nice showing for him, finishing third, according to most accounts here. Something that I heard today in watching some of the coverage, Rob, which I thought was a real advantage. Urban Meyer's Ohio State team, of their recruits today, 10 of those have already been on campus. They're already there, enrolled and already working out. So they weren't waiting around for people to just sign today. They got 10 in right off the bat as we go through the top 10 here. And again, most recruiting services are in line with one another. So if I quote a number of a ranking here that doesn't agree with the one you saw, it's probably generally close. I'm using, for our frame of reference here, the numbers put out by 247 Sports. USC, Clay Helton, big day at number 4. Jim Harbaugh, big day, number 5. FSU, 6. I think some people worried about what the Ed Orgeron permanent hiring would do to the team. Didn't do much in recruiting. We know he's been a master recruiter for years now. That's really been his claim to fame, and LSU finishes 7th. Oklahoma, not only 8th nationally, Rob, but they dominated the Big 12. If you just take these ratings numbers and treat them as if they're gospel, then Oklahoma really dominated the Big 12 today. Auburn 9 and Florida 10. That rounds out your top 10. I didn't see anything in that list, Rob, that surprised me. And when I went through the top 20, I would say the only real surprise I had was the fact that DJ Durkin in Maryland did the job that they did, finishing 19th or 18th, inside the top 20. That's a big deal for a school like Maryland in the Big Ten. Shows that there's a real good staff there going out and getting kids that may help this team become competitive in the Big Ten. But aside from what I just rattled off there, which is for the most part just general information on whether or where teams finished today, anything specifically that you saw that caught your interest?
Well, first, just a quick comment on New Mexico State and UTEP being ranked lower than some FCS schools. I think when you look at those type of programs that never win, and getting to a bowl game is a big deal for them, and UTEP's really recruiting against so many other prominent schools in Texas, they don't stand a chance. And you look at some of these players that might be getting recruited by a New Mexico State or a UTEP or some of these other really just bottom-rung Division I bowl programs. And these guys can go and maybe they'll stand out a little bit, but if the talent around them isn't there, it really becomes difficult for them to succeed. In order to be a great football player and to get noticed, people have to, A, be watching your games, and B, you have to be able to execute. And if the people around you can't execute, sometimes it hurts the perception of you as a player. So if they go to one of these top-level FCS schools where they're not going to get full exposure in terms of national broadcasts and things of that nature, but really, how many UTEP or New Mexico State games are on TV? These guys that are 3-star players or 2-star players that really weren't getting recruited by the big schools, they go to these FCS schools, they're playing around equally talented players. They have a chance to stand out. They have a chance to be noticed. And I think that's why it doesn't shock me that some of these FCS schools have a little more luck than a New Mexico State or a UTEP.
Yeah, and I would add to that, Rob, that just from a power ratings perspective, keeping power ratings over the course of the last, 24 years or so, and included in that FCS power ratings for the last 8 years, I can legitimately tell you there's some FCS teams that power rank or power rate, higher than a lot of FBS schools. And if those two, we see some of this happen in non-conference action, but, there's certainly plenty of cases where an FCS school would be favored over an FBS. I think the most notable one that we see, not as a favorite over an FBS school, but just to give you some idea of power, FCS against FBS, is the fact that North Dakota State comes and plays Big Ten schools, Big 12 Kansas State, and not only do they compete and cover point spreads, they win games. So a lot of good FCS football teams there that could step up and maybe fill 5 slots in the Sun Belt Conference right now and move 5 out. Definitely there's some better teams down there, and the recruiting game is what it is. It's why so many teams try to get on television now. Obviously, we have a lot of football on during the week, and it's why conferences like the MAC take those isolated games Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday to get some type of exposure. Conference USA, I know, or the American Athletic Conference, tries to get in on Friday nights to get some exposure for some of their lesser-known teams. You're absolutely right when it comes to that with kids nowadays. They want to see your program. They want to know the style that you play, and if it's suitable to them, they'll come.
I mean, if you just look at a position like wide receiver, if you're going to go play for a team that has no quarterback and no offensive line, the opportunities aren't there. But if you're going to go play for North Dakota State, there's going to be an opportunity for people to see what you can do.
Yeah, the kids, it's a different day and age where you could stockpile roster spots. Now you can't, obviously. You're limited on your roster, and you're limited to only 25 recruits. So kids looking for playing time may go to smaller schools. Sometimes grades play an effect or have an effect in these things. But overall, when you're being out-recruited by Harvard and Yale with as strict standards as they have, that's pretty tough right there. But I will say this, to end the season this year, the number 1 team in the Ivy League, which was Princeton, would have been favored over New Mexico State in a football game. So that goes to show you where the level of power is. Anything else, Rob, today, specifically or maybe generally that just caught your eye with the signing day? And then from there we'll head right into our 3 coaching changes of the week.
Well, I think 2 things are going to happen here. I'm going to transition us right into the Baylor conversation because I think one of the biggest things about Matt Rhule is, can he recruit in the state of Texas? Baylor finished right on the fringes of the top 40. I think ESPN had them 39. We can talk about that a little bit. But I think the fact that LSU didn't miss a beat with going from Les Miles to Ed Orgeron just shows, the draw of the SEC. I think Georgia at 3 in the ESPN rankings is really surprising to me. I mean, they were not a great football team last year. Nothing really would inspire somebody to say, hey, Georgia's right on the cusp of a national title. Let me go help them make the difference. And they still recruited very, very well. People want to play in the SEC. It's clearly, at least at this point, between them and the Big Ten, as the most watched conference in college football. I give the edge to the SEC just because they kind of try and do the standalone 3:30 on Saturday afternoon and try and make that their marquee game of the week. And people want to go there. They want to play. So I think the SEC in general had a really good recruiting class. I think you touched on Oklahoma really being a class above everybody else in the Big 12. And, I mean, really no surprises with Alabama, USC, the big names. So I think that it'll be really interesting to see as we get into spring practice how some of these guys look. That's really when I start paying attention to them. You get their first looks at them. You get a little bit of reporting from some of the, school websites about how some of the new guys looked and things of that nature. You just kind of get an idea of who might be an impact player right away and who's going to be redshirting or not really playing much or kind of just working their way into the rotation a little bit. So I don't put a whole lot of stock into these rankings. I really start to look at it more in the spring after, even though it's not a lot to go off of, at least you have a little something to go off of.
Yeah, we really do. And there's no doubt about it. In modern-day football now, true freshmen hit the playing field in bigger numbers than they did in years past. And I've been listening again to Urban Meyer this afternoon or this morning, absolutely said that some of his defensive back recruits are being counted on immediately at Ohio State, a big-time program like that. Sometimes in big-time programs you get shoved to the back of the line, but nowadays kids get brought in and they're counted on to play immediately. We saw the amount of freshmen that Ohio State played last year, pretty successful season. I want to make one other quick note, Rob, and then we're going to transition here over to our college football head coaching changes segment. But, you know, on National Signing Day, it's not all about high school kids. Inside your recruits sometimes are planted some transfers that are big deals. And for the Auburn Tigers, who had quarterback issues upon quarterback issues upon quarterback issues this season, you know, one of their biggest gems of this recruiting season is the fact that Jarrett Stidham, former quarterback from Baylor University, is going to be their quarterback next year. So it's not always the high school kids on this day that are the biggest prizes. Sometimes these transfers are even bigger, and we'll continue to see throughout the next 4 or 5 months a lot of graduate student transfers, guys that have finished up academically at one university and want to go somewhere else and play this season. There'll be a host of those. We'll try and keep track of those as we go through our show, our podcast, each and every week. But right now, let's go ahead and talk about some of these coaching changes, Rob, and how they may affect the team positively or negatively. If the team may change its look, we're going to go through a lot of system change stuff over the course of these next few months so that you guys are all prepared. Obviously, let me say this right off the top. The best source for all of this will be the Rob Veno Sports College Football Betting Guide, now in our 3rd year. You'll be able to get all this information. We have started our work real early this year in anticipation of getting the book out earlier this season. But if you're looking for system changes because of, you know, coaching staff moves, then it's definitely the place for you to go. We'll give you history of all these coaches, coordinators. We'll give you the systems that they run, what they plan to run here this season. Anybody who's gotten the book over the course of the last 2 years knows that it's filled with a ton of gambling information, probably the most point spread information of any college football book out there, including first half and second half ATS and over-under results. So once again, this college football podcast throughout the entire year now is kind of in tune with the fact that we are currently working on the book itself, the publication, hopefully available to everybody mid to late June this year rather than the early August date that we had last couple of seasons. We're going to start here with Baylor. For those of you who had joined myself and Derek the first week, you can go back and listen to that podcast. There's no problem going back and checking up and seeing what we talked about the first time around. Just to quickly let new listeners know, we spoke about the Nevada Wolfpack and their switch from Brian Polian to Jay Norvell. I happen to think that was it's complete addition by subtraction, getting rid of Brian Polian. There couldn't have been a better thing done by Nevada. So the Wolfpack probably helped themselves out a little bit. We talked about the Minnesota move, Tracy Claeys being fired, PJ Fleck in. Obviously, you know, you'd have to tout that as a good move, a positive for Minnesota. And then the third one was Oregon, out with Mark Helfrich, in with Willie Taggart. Of course, Oregon's gotten into some trouble already. One co-offensive coordinator fired, David Reeves. They had some guys in the weight room sent to the hospital, so they haven't gotten off to the greatest start. But I still believe that Willie Taggart is positive for Oregon, and maybe the country club lifestyle that Oregon kind of got used to. That might be changed a little bit here under Taggart. We're going to start tonight with the Baylor Bears. Rob hit on it a little bit earlier. Matt Rule, very successful. Both, Rob and I reside on the outskirts of Philadelphia, and we're pretty in touch with these programs. I think Rob, because of more time spent here for myself, it's about 12 years now, but Rob even longer, a little bit of good insight into these Philadelphia programs. And Matt Rule came along at the right time for Temple. They had just gotten back up in the saddle under Steve Adazio. Matt Rule took them to a new height, and now he's gone, and he's going to try and fix the mess that is Baylor. And Rob, I'll tell you, the trouble at Baylor never seems to end. Just within the last 5 days, we see a report about 55 cases or allegations of potential rape against the Baylor football squad. So it just never seems to end. Matt Rule, going to be a tough fixer-upper. I mean, they tried last year with Jim Grobe just to calm things down a little bit, but now Rule's in for the duration, signed a long-term contract with him. He has brought, for those like myself who were kind of, wondering, would the Baylor wide-open system disappear under Matt Rule? Because certainly it's not what he ran at Temple. Still haven't gotten firm confirmation. We'll wait to see what they do at spring practice here. But the hiring of these offensive coordinators or co-coordinators here, Rob, leads you to believe that Baylor is going to continue on, maybe not as wide open as they were, but they're going to continue to be a spread offense. As far as offensive coordinators go for this team, he's brought in Matt Lubick and Jeff Nixon. Now, Matt Lubick, if you have heard the last name before, then you know where this is going. This is Sonny Lubick's son, Matt, the co-offensive coordinator here. He's been involved with some programs that play fast-paced, up-tempo football, very un-Matt Rule-like, at least not what we saw here at Temple out of him. More methodical, more pound him with the running game, not the Art Briles style that was left behind in Baylor. But to see Lubick get hired, he comes over from the University of Oregon, where he was offensive coordinator last year. I'll say this to you, Rob. The one thing that Rule and Lubick may have in common is the fact that the Oregon spread really is run-oriented. They like to work the pass off of the run. It's not an air raid type system. So Rule's love for the running game combined with a run-oriented spread, maybe it will be a match made in heaven. Along with Matt Lubick at co-offensive coordinator will be Jeff Nixon. Jeff Nixon comes over from the NFL, NFL background, tight ends coach with the San Francisco 49ers. So, from an offensive standpoint, let's hit this first, Rob. It kind of took me a little bit by surprise that Rule would bring in a spread-minded offensive coordinator, but do you think that Matt Rule is more of a guy who wants to fit his system to his players, or do you think that, at least indicated by this, that maybe he's going to take the players and run the system around the players?
Well, I think Matt Rule is a very good coach. He stepped into a situation at Temple where, Temple's not an historically good program, and he kind of worked with what he had, and he built a team around that. So if you're going to take that same philosophy of work with what you have and then try to recruit your guys to eventually get to the point and play the system you want to play, you're probably going to start out as a spread wide open offense because that's what Baylor's used to playing. That's what they recruit for. That's what their talent is. And I wouldn't be surprised if in year one they do a lot of that. But as he gets his guys in there, I don't truly think that's the type of football he wants to play 3-4 years from now. But he's a very smart coach. He understands the personnel he has, and I don't think he's going to rush into anything. I think it'll be a gradual transition. You might not really even notice too much that it's happening, but I think it will happen, that he'll go to a more traditional offense at some point.
And with that in mind, and I think you're absolutely correct. I think that that's exactly the plan that Matt Rule is going to go with, because it would be very hard to do a 360-degree turnaround in 1 year. But let's look at this. Knowing what we know about Texas high school football at this stage here in 2017, with the masterminds, offensive masterminds that have come out of Texas high school programs and come on to run college football programs. College football in Texas is very much spread-oriented. It's where Art Briles came from, Texas high school football. It's where Gus Malzahn came from. The list goes on and on of Texas high school coaches who have brought their wide-open offensive ways into college football. With that in mind, how difficult do you think it would be for Matt Rule to be able to recruit from the state of Texas the type of players that he would want to run his more methodical system? It would seem that with the direction that high school football has gone, that's kind of a Matt Rule style, is kind of a dinosaur trail type of style, and perhaps not attractive to a lot of high school kids. Do you think that will affect him as far as getting the players he wants in there, or do you think they'll still be able to grab the offensive lineman needed and the back and wide receivers?
Help him a little bit. And the reason I say it might help him a little bit is because there is a certain caliber of player, a certain type of player that fits the more traditional offense versus this just air it out kind of offense. Those type of players have less choices of where to go. And if you can go to a big name program like Baylor in the Big 12 in the state of Texas, and you know you're going to get the exposure on TV, you know you're going to be in some of these big primetime games, it might actually help a little bit that he's trying to move against the tide, because the high schools that do run those type of programs and are still churning out a ton of talent, there's less options for those players now. So to add Baylor back into the mix in the state of Texas, I think is a really good thing. I mean, you look at TCU, they're high-tempo, high-octane, throw the ball. You look at Texas Tech, they're all about airing it out. Texas still plays traditional offense to an extent, but even they're starting to get a little cuter with their offense just because you have to survive at this point in time. So when I say that Matt Rule is going to go run a very traditional offense, it's going to still have enough wrinkles in it that some of these run-and-gun kind of players are still going to have opportunities to make plays and succeed at Baylor.
And I'll make a prediction here, and then we'll get on to the defensive coordinator. I think, Rob, what will wind up happening here, knowing that he didn't hire Matt Lubick as offensive coordinator just to go ahead and get rid of him down the road because he wants to be more methodical, I'm of the opinion that Baylor's offense will wind up looking a lot like Bob Stoops' Oklahoma offense did this year. Oklahoma, 2 years ago, hired air raid offensive coordinator Lincoln Riley, came from Texas Tech under Mike Leach, went to East Carolina, and was the offensive coordinator there. They threw the ball all over the lot. Came to Oklahoma because Bob Stoops wanted to keep up with the Joneses, all those teams you just mentioned, and then some. Texas A&M, obviously, or excuse me, not Texas A&M. But now with Charlie Strong last year hiring a couple of guys from Tulsa to run their offense and make it more high-powered, the whole point to this is that even though Lincoln Riley is an air raid style offensive coordinator and that's what he knows best, when push came to shove the last couple of years with Oklahoma, those handoffs went to Samaje Perine and Joe Mixon. And when Oklahoma wanted to wear teams down and extend margin in the second half, they went with an air raid offensive coordinator and an air raid style to a running attack. And I just get the feeling that that's the direction Matt Rule is going to go. He's going to have the threat of the pass available, but much like the way Stoops, and it's real different when you're running a spread offense, but you're pounding the running game. Everybody watched Oklahoma play, and you know what Pirine and Mixon did as far as ball control is concerned. So I think that's kind of the style that this team may take on. It's kind of like the Gus Malzahn offense as well down there at Auburn. We'll see. I think that Matt Rule will probably end up being a cross, which I think is what you were getting at actually, somewhere between, all-out spread and traditional bad weather style, run the football type offense. I think he'll fall somewhere right in the middle. What we know for sure about this, Rob, is that he brought his own defensive coordinator with him. Phil Snow was the DC for the Temple teams, which the last couple of years were tremendous. And Phil Snow comes with him to Baylor. So go ahead and talk about what it will be like for Phil Snow as defensive coordinator, knowing that they can probably get a hold of a lot more speed and a lot more athleticism recruiting for Baylor than they could at Temple, even though they put together great defenses at Temple.
Well, I think that Matt Rule, for some of the successes he had offensively at Temple, it really was the Temple defense in a conference that really isn't known for defense. Kind of stood out there. They played very well. Their defense kept them in a lot of games, even when they were having offensive struggles, good at forcing turnovers. And I think that they're going to have to, and I think this is going to be the biggest thing, they're going to have to recruit a lot of speed guys, and they're going to need depth with how quick some of these offenses move today, especially in the Big 12. Your defense can get worn down quickly. You're going to need to have a lot of depth. So not only is he going to need to recruit for the starting 11, you're going to need to look a little further behind that into your second-string defensive lineman, who's going to be able to come in and spell these starters and get pressure on the quarterback, these safeties in the secondary when they need a blow, who's going to come in and make sure you don't give up a 60-yard pass. I think he's going to need to recruit depth more than talent at the top level. I think he's going to have a lot of luck getting a lot of the type of players over the next 2 years or so. I think the defense is going to happen a lot quicker than the offense because I think he's a lot more comfortable with it. And I think I look for the defense to kind of make their improvements before the offense does.
Yeah, and just for the record here, we should note that, Matt Rule defended against a lot of wide-open offenses in the AAC. Now, granted, they're not athletically man-for-man at the same caliber as Big 12 offensive units are, but when you're facing SMU and Chad Morris's spread, when you're facing South Florida and what Willie Taggart ran down there the last couple of years with Quentin Flowers at quarterback for a spread offense, when you're facing Tulsa and Philip Montgomery, ex-Baylor offensive coordinator, Tulsa's offense was as dynamic throwing the football as there was in the country. When you're facing Houston and that spread offense, they faced a lot of this stuff. Matt Rule and his defensive coordinator, Phil Snow, faced an awful lot of these types of offenses already. Normally, they require, A, a pass rush, B, 6 defensive backs, 7 defensive backs that can all be interchangeable. So he knows what he's in for here. It's at a higher level athletically, but there shouldn't be much here that surprises Matt Rule. I think, overall, Rob, I don't know, I'll ask you to go ahead and assess it. For lack of a better use of a grading system, let's go ahead from 1 to 5 or A to F, however you choose, the hiring of Matt Rule. And I don't want to talk about just this year because Matt Rule is going to have to rebuild the program. But let's say over the course of the next 3 years, give a grade to how you think Baylor did by hiring Matt Rule here to come in and try and turn things around.
I'll give him a B. I don't necessarily think Matt Rule is the most talented X's and O's football coach, but I think Matt Rule brings a sense of stability to the program, and that's what this program needs. I think he's in it for the duration. I don't think he's going to be a 2-year guy and out. He's going to see this thing through. He's a committed coach. He built back up the Tempo program, and I think that he'll definitely be able to do the same with Baylor. So while he may lack a little bit in the X's and O's aspect of things, I think that the stability he's going to bring to the program, he was the right hire for what Baylor needed at the moment they needed it. I'll give him a B.
I'd probably agree with you there. I think for a lot of the reasons you just cited, Matt Rule, the Baylor University probably deserves a B for this hire. Matt Rule, a guy who's going to create a different culture there, try and, stop the freight train, so to speak, and then push it in the right direction. At the same time, winning football games. It's not the easiest conference to win in, but Baylor's still going to be able to recruit. So I'm with you. I would say that a B for Matt Rule. Maybe he'll surprise and do even better. I like the fact that he brought his own DC with him, and I like the fact that he's not trying to reinvent the wheel as far as offense is concerned down there. Let's move to Connecticut, Rob. A real interesting coaching move here. It happened late in the season, late in the off season, you and I actually touched on this a little bit during one of our, I think it was a bowl podcast that we did when we were going through bowl games, handicapping point spreads and totals for those. Randy Edsall rehired by Connecticut, and like I said, it was at a real late date. It was more than a month after Connecticut's regular season had ended, and you start to think about recruiting at that point. If UConn was going to hire a new coach, why didn't they do it immediately? Why did they wait 30-some-odd days, knowing that, National Signing Day was coming on February 1? It led to some difficulties in one particular letter of intent where Randy Edsall had to go back and apologize, but it really was bad publicity for the school where the kid actually asked the university and Randy Edsall if he was still going to, be one of their recruits, and they told him yes, and then they pulled the scholarship out from underneath him. Not a good way to get going, but I think the most interesting part about this, aside from Edsall to begin with, which, hey, when he was there, he actually put UConn on the map, football-wise. They went to the Fiesta Bowl his very last season before he bolted for Maryland on that infamous plane ride home from Arizona. But how about this? For offensive coordinator, he brings in Rhett Lashley. Rhett Lashley, for those who don't know, was the offensive coordinator at Auburn last year. Not only the offensive coordinator at Auburn last year, but the guy that Gus Malzahn gave up the play-calling reins to about 4 weeks into the season last year. There 4 or 5 weeks, I forget what it was, when Gus Malzahn finally said, you know what, we're not going anywhere offensively, and he's a real hands-on guy with the offense, but he gave it over to Lashley. They started to score a bunch of points. Some would point out that it was against lesser foes, and when they played the better teams, they didn't score that well. I would tend to somewhat agree with that. The proof is in the pudding when you look at the numbers. But Rhett Lashley, a spread guy, coming to Connecticut to run the Gus Malzahn system under Randy Edsall. And on the defensive side of the football, maybe a guy you can give us some insight into, Rob. But Billy Crocker, the defensive coordinator here, was the defensive coordinator for Villanova. And we know Villanova, over the course of, I'm going to go 5 or 6 years, for the most part, for the majority of that time, has been a very, very good defensive team. They were a real good defensive team last year. Crocker's in as defensive coordinator here for Edsel. Lashley is the offensive coordinator. Go ahead and just give us some opinions on those three guys. Randy Edsel, head coach, Lashley, offensive coordinator, Crocker at DC, and how they may affect UConn this year.
Well, I don't think UConn's offense can get much worse than it's been. So I think it's nothing to go but up for them there. I just think, in general, we've touched on this before, I found this to be the most bizarre coaching change in recent memory for me. I mean, you look at Connecticut's season, they were absolutely horrific all year. Their season was done the first weekend of October. Quite frankly, their season was done in September. And, I mean, you could just see this was a program going nowhere. And by October, you really could have a feel that, look, this just isn't working. So, okay, you want to ride it out for the season. You don't want to create any instability with the players there in October or November. Okay, I understand that. But come Thanksgiving weekend, UConn should have been announcing that they were firing a coach and looking for someone else. They did this way after the fact, and to bring back Randy Edsel after the way he left the program the first time around, I'm sure he had to do some fence mending, but just absolutely bizarre. I've never seen anything like it before. I don't know about you.
Yeah, to me, and I'm a Connecticut native. Obviously, 31 years in the state of Connecticut, and had a lot of friends and nieces, nephews, the whole life that have gone through Storrs, Connecticut, and remain relatively close to the situation there. I was, like you, Rob, I was totally shocked that was their choice. Yeah, I could harp on the negative, but I will say this, for a positive, that Rhett Lashley hire made a ton of sense, and it doesn't seem like it would make sense to bring him to Storrs, Connecticut, and even less sense for him to make the move from the SEC, where he's got a pretty good reputation, all the way to the American Athletic Conference, to Storrs, Connecticut, to be the offensive coordinator of one of the most pathetic offenses in FBS football last year. But the move should pay dividends for UConn in the fact that 3 games from the end of the season last year, they pulled the red shirt tag off of quarterback Donovan Williams, and he played the last 3 games. And for those who saw him play, tall, lanky kid, and in fact, he's beginning to fill out a little bit. He's not exactly Vince Young lanky, a little more weight to Williams than that, but he's a really good running quarterback, and he's got a cannon for an arm. And if you want to run that type of offense, we saw a little bit of it in action toward the end of last year with a running quarterback at 6'4", 215, and a guy who can throw the football. Nobody better to bring in than a guy like Lashley, who is an expert at that type of style. So I think it'll pay dividends for UConn over the long haul, having Lashley work with that offense. But UConn is so shy on players and talent that, and it's going to be one of those 360 polar opposite type moves here, Rob, because remember back to last year, and we wrote this in the betting guide last year, that UConn basically built their offense on what Rex Ryan would call ground and pound. 5 huge road graders up front, and they were going to run the football, play defense, punt the ball, play field position, and try and win games 16-13. Didn't pan out. They did their part. They got the 13 or the 16, but they couldn't win a lot of games that way. So it's a complete turnaround for this team, but I think it's based on the fact that they have a really, really good dual-threat quarterback here in Donovan Williams. We'll see over the course of time if it helps or not. And obviously Crocker comes with some FCS credentials. Connecticut's always been or always had defense as their anchor, so to speak, for their football team. So perhaps Crocker can continue that tradition for them. There's been some good defensive coordinators come through Storrs, Connecticut. That's an interesting move. We'll leave that. To me, it's an average at best hire. If Edsel could come in and do what he did the first time around, he was probably working with less the first time he came in. He had an 11-year stint there at UConn. If he can come in and do that again, I'm not so sure. This is a guy who was very unsuccessful at Maryland. Maybe he'd rather try and work in the smaller pond of the American Athletic Conference, but I'm not big on the hire. I tried to, like I say, give a little positive edge to it with Lashley, but we'll see. I'm pretty sure you're going to grade him the same way, but do you even get him up to the C level or no?
Quite frankly, I think the whole thing was terrible. I'd give it an F. But in terms of what they can do, I think a C is warranted. And the only reason I say that is because I think they have the staff in place now, assuming Edsel doesn't have any of these off-field distractions and he's taking care of everything he needed to do, smoothing over with some of the boosters and whatnot. And if they're really going to be able to build this program up, they don't play in a great conference. They're one or two big playmakers away, and they might have found one in their quarterback, from being a upper half of the conference football team. I mean, they've got to recruit. They're going to need a couple good recruiting classes, but it wouldn't shock me overall if UConn's turnaround, if it's going to happen, happens quicker than Baylor's turnaround.
Yeah, and sometimes a good mention there, Rob, of the lack of conference strength. Sometimes it happens for teams. We see it in Conference USA, a conference of similar stature to that of the AAC. We see it sometimes in Mountain West play where you can get from bottom to top. Just look at what Wyoming did this year out in the Mountain West. You can get from bottom to top in a lesser conference a little bit quicker. Sometimes it's real hard to climb over powerful kingpins, which Baylor will have to. Baylor was just there 2 years ago. They're going to have to try and get back to that status. And it's a little bit harder when you're jumping big-time teams that are on the rise. Last one that we'll talk about here, and this one's a bit intriguing to me. Purdue, maybe they were a year too late in firing Darrell Hazel, but he is now gone. And in his place comes Western Kentucky's Jeff Brom. Obviously, Western Kentucky, very prolific offense the last 2 years under Brom. Before that, Bobby Petrino was the head coach. Brom was his offensive coordinator. They set some records with a very fast-paced offense, and offense which Bobby Petrino used to refer to as push it down the hashes. They like to go vertical. They will throw the sideways, side to side, and spread you out passes as well, bubble screens and whatnot, and try to get really good athletes in space. All of it's incorporated into a Jeff Brom offense. Purdue, if nothing else, Rob, they've increased the amount of speed and they've increased the amount of playmakers that they have on this team. So despite the fact that they were down the bottom of the Big Ten barrel, I tend to think that was more because of their lack of defense, their inability to stop opponents, especially from running the football. You watched some Purdue games this year, and they just got run over. So offensively, I think Brom can do some good things here. He brought with him his defensive coordinator, Nick Holt, from Western Kentucky. Nick Holt, in the past has been defensive coordinator at USC. So big-name guy. In the Conference USA, faced a lot of high-flying offenses, and teams put up a lot of points against Western Kentucky over the last 3 years. But, to be fair to Western Kentucky, statistically they were better than a lot of those other schools. And when your offense is scoring touchdowns in a minute and 30 seconds and your defense is right back out on the field, it's very, very difficult to, hold people under 24 points. So for WKU, they were able to outscore a lot of opponents by double digits rather easily because they could score so quick. You know, the last time Purdue went this route, it was the hire of a guy named Joe Tiller from Wyoming. And Joe Tiller, of course, had Drew Brees to direct his offense. But, boy, at that point in time, late 90s, Joe Tiller kind of took the Big Ten by storm. It's not that way anymore. Now it's 2017, and that style of offense is very commonplace across the country. I like Brom. I think it's a good hire. I think he can increase success for Purdue. Of course, you can't get much lower. Same thing you had kind of just mentioned about UConn. You can't go any lower than where Purdue is already. But I've seen enough of Western Kentucky over the past couple of years to think that Brom can be successful here. I don't know in Purdue's terms. Success probably means 6-6 in a bowl game. But they are in the West, right? And when you're in the Big Ten West, what that means is you don't have to play or you don't have to defeat in the standings Ohio State and Michigan and probably a bounce-back year out of Michigan State. So even though Wisconsin's here, even though Minnesota with Fleck is here, Nebraska's here, it's easier of the two divisions. So maybe he can make a little bit of headway with this Purdue team. I like him from an offensive standpoint. I think he'll be fun for the fans. I think he'll put points on the board. But, boy, defensively it could still be trouble. How do you see Brom taking over at Purdue?
Well, I think you've set the expectation right where it's going to be 6-6 in a bowl game is success for Purdue. They're just not cut out to compete with the Michigans, the Michigan States, the Ohio States, even the Penn States. They do come from the softer side, but you're still looking at Nebraska and Wisconsin. These are good football teams, and Purdue doesn't recruit like them. They don't draw the talent like them, and I don't think this hire does anything to make people say, wow, I want to go play for Purdue now. And it's just tough. I mean, I don't know if Les Miles had no interest in Purdue or Purdue had no interest in him, but if you don't have a marquee coach to go up against some of these big-name coaches, you're already having trouble recruiting. I think you needed a bigger name to really fire Purdue up, and I don't think that happened. Might they get a little bit better? Yes, like we said, bowl game, but is that really what you want to compete for every year, 6-6 and playing in the Holiday Bowl in San Diego? I mean, no, that's not what you're looking for.
Yeah, and, as far as recruiting day went today, Rob, it didn't go well for Purdue. 14th out of 14 Big Ten teams. I
didn't even know they were the last one in the Big Ten, but I just knew that name isn't going to help you recruit people.
Yes, where kids might want to go to Purdue is your skill-type wide receivers, running backs, and quarterbacks because they'll be able to, and Brom probably will be able to sell them on the offense, and kids are just attracted to playing time in those styles of offenses that are going to try and put up 50 a game. Now, you can put up 50 a game in Conference USA when you're playing Rice and the conference opponents that they play there. To put up 50 a game in the Big Ten is a totally different story, but I think it'll be more fun. Darrell Hazel never really created an identity for this Purdue team. Might take some time here offensively, but I do, and my gripe with this, the bigger question would still be defensively. I just don't know that they're going to be able to get the type of defensive players needed to stop these offenses of these other teams. They're not as big. K'Wan Short came out of Purdue a couple of years ago, and we see him having a lot of success in the NFL for the Carolina Panthers. It was a pretty high draft choice. But Purdue doesn't get enough of those guys. You can't have one. We know that defensive line rotations usually go 7, 8, 9 deep. for the real good schools. So I think defensively they're still going to be up against it. They're going to try and occasionally be able to outscore, out-execute people on the scoreboard with their offense. Might not happen year one, but if Brom has any appeal to him, it'll be with his offensive system. Again, 14th this year in recruiting out of 14 Big Ten teams, and that's behind Rutgers. I mean, Rutgers finished number 9 in the Big Ten this year, so nice job there by Chris Ash and Rutgers. Rob, that covers what we wanted to cover here today. By the way, we're going to go through these coaching changes with a fine-tooth comb the way we did here this evening, 3 at a time. We'll go through the course of the college football off-season, keep you updated on spring practices, keep you updated.
Rob, before we wrap it up, I just wanted to throw one other thing
Go ahead.
at you. Alabama quarterback transferred to Arizona State, now has the okay to play the entire season. He went to junior college after he left Bama, got the waiver, has the okay to begin the season with Arizona State. I think he competes for the starting job right away, and it could be a big help to a program that's on the cusp of being respectable. Your thoughts?
Yeah, well, it's huge for Arizona State, obviously, and a Todd Graham offense. Quarterback means everything. They had their difficulties at quarterback this year, a lot of it due to injuries. You know, they had a lot of guys sidelined this year, and you can't really blame the head coach for that, although I do think that Todd Graham is very, very happy to be able to get a big-time quarterback in there because, like I say, his hot seat isn't going to get any cooler unless he starts winning games. But you hope for their sake that they stay healthy. And, you know, between them and Arizona last year, the 2 Arizona schools really suffered through a huge amount of injuries. We'll see how it goes, but it's a big score for Arizona State. There's no other way around it. And hopefully, like I say, it'll help them on the football field. And more than anything else, I think that health is the one thing that's going to help them. You know, where Alabama's concerned, I just want to get at this real quick here, Rob. And this kind of goes back to Mark Helfrich's firing at Oregon. You know, Marcus Mariota came to Oregon from East St. Louis High School in Honolulu, Hawaii. And they had another quarterback this year by the name, and I hope I pronounce it right, Tua Tagovailoa, or Vagaloa. But he was
If you didn't pronounce it right, I wouldn't know the difference.
Well, the point to the whole story is that he was extremely highly touted in high school down there at East St. Louis High School, or out there at East St. Louis High School in Honolulu. And Helfrich didn't really make the effort to go after him, and I think that ended up being his demise here, among other things, but I think it was a piece to the puzzle. But the funny thing about it is, you know where the kid landed today? He landed at Alabama. And perhaps some of the reason for the transfer to Arizona State, some of the reason for Mark Helfrich not having a job at Oregon anymore, but Alabama landed a Hawaiian quarterback, extremely highly touted here today, and give all the credit in the world to Nick Saban for stealing somebody from a region where, you know, those Pac-12 schools are supposed to be on top of those kids, whether it be University of Washington, whether it be University of Oregon, whether it be one of the Arizona schools, USC. Normally, those kids stay west, and it didn't happen here. So Alabama, you know, the old saying, the rich get richer, they got richer once again today.
Yeah, it is very interesting. I mean, you normally think of players from Hawaii, and they're California, they're at Oregon, they're at Washington State. They're not at Alabama. So that was a very interesting signing for Alabama today.
Yeah, with a direct pipeline like that, like Oregon has, when you come from the same high school as Marcus Mariota came from, it should be a slam dunk no-brainer. It didn't happen for Oregon. We know they've gone to the FCS ranks the last 2 years for their quarterback. And it's just interesting that Helfrich did not land that kid. I'm really, really surprised at that. But be as it may, Alabama, we know they got the most talent of any, at least according to high school recruiting experts. They today got more talent than anybody else in the land. So Alabama, your national championship runner-up, gets even better with their freshman incoming class. Next week, as I mentioned, we will go over 3 more coaching changes. We might talk a little bit more about recruiting and teams that did well, teams that didn't do well, how it applies to some of the coaching changes across the nation. Spring practice is not that far away. We're talking about another 3 weeks for some teams, mostly a month for the majority of teams before they hit the spring practice field again. So we'll have a lot to talk about year-round here with you here on the Wednesday podcast. Once again, the Rob Veno Sports College Football Betting Guide in the works right now. Be available probably mid to late June. Just a ton of info in there. So hopefully we can get it out there so you guys can all purchase, and it'll help your handicapping, 10, 100, 1,000-fold. Certainly you'll have any information you need at your fingertips. So for myself, Rob Veno, and tonight's guest analyst, Rob O'Connor, we'd like to say thanks for listening. Good luck to everybody out there with their Super Bowl endeavors this week, and we'll talk to you again next Wednesday.